store more complex data in a file, rather than just single strings as we've been seeing. And a CSV file is just the way to do that, when you need to store slightly more complex data, but maybe not necessarily too complex. Instead of storing one thing per line, now we can store, well, we're still storing one thing per line, really, but now the thing has commas in there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to split the line by the comma, and that's going to give us multiple pieces of data. So here, for example, we've got a name, an age, a university, and a degree that somebody's doing. This gives us information about a single person. The first row tells us the headings of the data, so that when we look at the file, we can tell what it means. The first column is the name, second one is the age, third one is the university, last one is the degree. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a program that is going to read these 3 lines, not the first one, and it's going to print out the information about this person in a slightly nicer way, just to experiment with reading CSV files. Let's go over to csv_read.py, a file that I've just created, and we are going to begin. The first thing to do is, of course, read the lines in the file. I'm sure you can do that. Hopefully you got that. What to do is, of course, open the csv_data.txt in read mode, and then we can look at the lines, and that's going to be file.readlines. And then we can close the file. Now we've got all the lines, that's from line number 1, 2, 3, and 4, including the new line characters at the end and all the characters in the line. Now what we want to do is ignore the first line. So what to do is say lines equals lines 1 colon. If you remember from when we looked at lists, this is called slicing a list, and it lets us essentially get only a part of the list. We're going to change this lines variable to now be what the lines variable was, but only from index 1 onwards. So we're going to get index 1 onwards. That's 1, 2, and 3 here. We're going to ignore the first line. Of course, we also want to remove any white space, like new line characters, so we can put this inside a list comprehension that says line.strip for line in that, in the slice. The reason why I do this here instead of up here is so that we are only stripping the lines that we want to strip and not the first line, since we don't actually care about it. Now that we've got these lines, we can iterate over them. And we can say that the person that we're going to analyze is the entire line, but we want to get the data in it, which is separated by commas. So what do we do? Well, as we did in the last video, we're going to split the line by the comma. So we're going to say person data equals line.split on the comma. That's going to give us a list of various elements. The first one's going to be Rolf, second one is going to be 25, third one is going to be MIT, and the fourth one is going to be computer science. So the list is going to have 4 elements. In order to make it easier for us to work with this program, I'm going to create a variable per element. It's not something you have to do, but I like doing that. So name equals person data 0, age equals person data 1, university equals person data 2, and the degree is person data 3. Now, of course, you'll get an index error if your file does not have the right format, but I mean, that's a problem in any case. Whenever you're interacting with files or with databases or anything else, your program's going to be reasonably coupled to the data that you're interacting with. So, that's a problem that we have to deal with if it happens. Now that we've got the name, age, university, and degree, we can print out a line saying, this person is 25 years old and is studying computer science at MIT. So we can print something like name is age, studying a degree at university. Now, The problem when we do this, let's run the file, is that it doesn't look so fantastic. You know, there's no uppercase letters, no capitals anywhere. Let's make it a bit nicer. And the way we're going to do that is by using some built-in methods of the string class that allows us to add capital letters and so forth in various places. For the name, we're going to use .title. And that just turns into title case. So the first letter of every word is going to be uppercase. For degree, we are going to use capitalize, because that turns the first letter only into uppercase. And for university, we're going to use title as well. For that turns the first letter of every word uppercase. Okay, let's run the file again. And now we can see that it looks a bit nicer. We got Rolf is 25, studying computer science at MIT. Okay, this doesn't look so fantastic, but I think this is a data problem. There's no way for us to know that the university is an acronym. So in that case, I think the data should be all uppercase if we wanted it to be like that. I think that's a small side problem. We don't have to worry too much about it. Of course, instead of applying Python code in here, I've told you before how I don't really like that. Putting Python code inside the string, it looks a bit ugly. I think that we should instead put these title and capitalize functions in the appropriate places here. That way it just makes it a bit nicer, a bit easier to read. Okay. Of course, this is allowing us to read the CSV file, extract the data from it, and then potentially print it out. We could multiply things, we could calculate new datas, we could analyze it, whatever you want to do with Python code. If you wanted to write to the file, it's exactly the same as writing any other file, except you'd be writing a big string with various things separated by commas. Like you could write Rolf 25, computer science, or rather MIT computer science. If you write that into the file, that's all you need. That is going to mimic exactly what we've got in here. So writing a CSV just means joining the constituent values you want to write with a comma. And that's pretty straightforward. And by the way, just for context, the way you do that is a sample CSV value is you do comma dot join, and in here you put a list of values you want to join, like Rolf 25 MIT computer science. And this is how you would join a list of values into a CSV. And down here, see, this is what this prints out. I just wanted to give you this info just in case you want to, store some values in a CSV. Using this syntax, string.join is going to join every element of this list to each other using this character here as the joining character. If you want to use a colon instead, you can do that, of course, and then your string will just look like this. It will look like the various constituent values, but joined by colons. You can use any character you want, as long as it's not a character that's going to appear inside the data. For example, if you use the space to join it, you'd have a problem because one of your values has the space, and then, of course, you're gonna have multiple values. You're gonna have 5 values instead of 4 when push comes to shove. See. Now you've got a space here, space here, space here, and space here, even though this should be one single value. That's why you have to use a value here that won't appear in any of the strings. A comma is normally a good choice, so is a colon, so is a hash symbol. These things normally don't appear. When you are then reading the data, instead of splitting by the comma, you can just split by the hash symbol. And that's the same thing. It stops being a CSV file, now it's instead of a comma-separated value file, now it's a hash. Most, if not the most, popular format for data in the world. Especially extremely popular for web applications, and that's because JSON comes from the most popular web language, JavaScript. Indeed, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Here's what some JSON could look like. You've got some sort of curly braces at the start and at the end. Then you've got a key. Around it, there are double quotation marks, that's important. And then you've got a colon, and you can have a value associated with that key. Does it remind you of anything in Python? I hope that it reminds you of a dictionary, because it looks pretty similar to a dictionary. In fact, it looks the same as a dictionary. There are just a couple of differences between JSON, that is this thing here, and a Python dictionary. The first and most important difference is something you have to remember whenever you deal with JSON, and that is that JSON is a string. Notice how this piece of JSON here is inside a text file. And what are the contents of text files? That's correct. All the contents of text files are strings, as we saw when we read our CSV file, and as we saw when we read our plain old data file. Text files always contain strings only. When we read this, it will be a string, and we will convert it into a Python dictionary. The second difference is that JSON must always use double quotation marks and not single quotation marks. So if you do this, which is perfectly valid in Python, it will not be valid JSON, so don't do that. And some programs that read and write JSON require that the outermost element here, the outermost construct, the outermost structure, be an object. This thing here that we call a dictionary in Python is an object in JavaScript. They're very similar. When talking about JSON, the structure with these curly braces, we call it an object, because that's what it's called in JavaScript. I know that in Python they're called dictionaries. Some programs, however, and that's important, don't have this requirement. So in some programs, you could have a file called friends.json.txt that is just this. And this would be okay for some programs. And notice how the indentation here is slightly off. Let me fix it real quick. This would be okay for some programs, but not others. Some have the requirement that the outermost structure be an object, that's a dictionary. Some do not have this requirement, and this would be fine. For our example, we are going to stick with our object as the outermost structure. So let's read some JSON using Python. Python comes with a built-in module that you can import and use called the JSON module. We're going to talk a lot more about importing as we move on in this section. We're going to be importing our own files and modules as well as system modules. So let's start with importing the JSON module. But before we import the JSON module itself, let's talk a little bit about importing. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new file that I'm going to call something like JSON imports. Important, do not call this file JSON, because the JSON module already exists in Python. We're going to import it like so. So if you call your file JSON, that's going to confuse Python. Try to not have your files or any of your packages named after something that already exists in Python, or indeed try not to have duplicate names for files and things like that. Just a general piece of advice there. So in Python, as we've done a couple of times before in the course, sort of glanced over it, we can import things. And these things are code that other developers have written so that we don't have to write it ourselves. And now we're importing the JSON module, which contains some functions that allow us to import the JSON file and convert it into a dictionary, and also to go the other way around, turn a dictionary into JSON data. Remember, JSON data is very much like a dictionary, but it is a string. And remember that someone did write this JSON module in the same way that we are writing this file, and somebody wrote all the other built-in functions in Python, like len, or sum, or even like things like print. All of these have been written by someone, and they are made available to us to use globally in all our Python files. The only difference is that this JSON module is not included by default on all your files, because whoever created Python thought that it may not be necessary in all cases. So the JSON module is a module that comes with Python, but it is not a global module. We must make it explicit that we want to use it by importing it at the top of the file, like so. So we've created a file that contains our friends as JSON, and notice how this is a friends key, and that is associated with a list, and that contains 3 objects inside of it. I'm going to try really hard to call these objects when I'm talking about JSON and dictionaries when I'm talking about Python, but please bear with me if I do make any mistakes. These are objects in JSON, dictionaries in Python, but only when we import them using this JSON module. Then we've got the JSON file, the JSON module imported, and now we have the ability to do things like JSON dot and access, as long as you're using PyCharm or something else that will recommend functions, we can access the functions in that module. Notice how this JSON module is not an object, it's not a class, because we didn't have to create a new JSON object in order to access things. This module here allows us to use some functions, but they are not inside a class. And indeed, in PyCharm, you can go into the JSON module by clicking Command-click or Control-click if you're on Windows. And you can see the source code of the module here. You can see that a lot of it is these comments that tell you how to use the functions, but primarily there are some functions definitions like dump, and you can see the source code and what it does. You've got dump s, and you can see the arguments and the source code and all the comments and everything there. So as you can see, this is just code, like the one we write, except we didn't write it, but we can still import it. And notice how as we go through the file, these functions are at the lowest level of indentation. They are at the very left, which means they are not inside a class. So as we import the module, we'll have access to those functions directly. Okay, feel free to read through that module if you want to have a wee look at what it's in there, but we're going to be using only a couple of functions in this video. The first thing you need is a file pointer. For that, we're going to use the open function, of course, and we have to use an equal sign. And we're going to open the friends_json.txt for reading. So you know how to do that. friends_json.txt in reading mode. Then we're going to load the contents. The way to do that is to do file contents, for example, is json.load of the file pointer. So the load function inside the JSON module takes in a file pointer that is going to load the JSON from. As part of reading the file, by the way, this reads the entire file, it also turns it into a dictionary. So now file contents is a dictionary. Reads file and turns it to dictionary. Then, of course, we can close the file. And now we can use the file contents for whatever we want. For example, we can print file contents friends 0. And that should print this dictionary here. Okay, remember, if you're using PyCharm, you may be tempted to press the top right play button, but it's likely that that's going to play the wrong file, csv_read in this case. So if that's the case, just right-click the JSON imports file and run it. And there you have it. We print out the dictionary with name Jose and degree applied computing. That's what I studied at university. This is how you load a JSON file into a dictionary that you can then use as normal. So here we're accessing the friends key, and then we're accessing the 0th element of the friends key. If you want to do the opposite, and you want to write a Python dictionary as a JSON file, that's also something you can do. For example, we are going to write into a file called cars_JSON. So we're going to do cars equal this list here of dictionaries. And by the way, something I tend to do, just because I program a lot on JavaScript, is have this space after the dictionary. And Python doesn't really like that, so if I do that, I apologize. I just find it a bit more readable. But that's just because I do a lot of JavaScript, and that's convention in JavaScript as well. So now we have 2 dictionaries inside our list. And of course, as I said earlier, we can totally save this as JSON. It doesn't need to have a dictionary enclosing it, although some programs may request that you have that. So again, if you want to save this to a dictionary, you know exactly what to do. Open the file, save the contents into the file, and then close it. How are you going to save the contents? Instead of json.load, you're going to use json.dump. So here's what you have to do. Go and investigate how to use json.dump. Or optionally, just wait until after I ask you pause the video and you try this yourself, and I will implement this for you. If you are so inclined, pause the video now and give this a go. Investigate how to use JSON.dump, and then save this list into a new file that you can call cars_json.txt. I'll see you in a few seconds. I hope you got that. If you did go and investigate json.dump, congratulations, well done. By investigating, you're going to learn faster. And there are multiple ways you could have investigated. You could have Googled json.dump Python, and one of those first few links would be the official Python documentation. Another option, you could have gone into the JSON module with command click if you're on Mac, or control click if you're on Windows. And there you could have found this documentation here for the dump function. Then it tells you what it does. It serializes the obj parameter as a JSON formatted stream to FP, a .write supporting file-like object. Now I appreciate this is some lingo that we've got here. Serializing means turning to a string. FP is normally a file pointer, and it tells you here that it has to be a file-like object that allows you to do .write. That's what we've been doing with our text files when we've been writing to them. So this dump takes in a object, and that's going to get turned into a string and saved into FP. Therefore, if we go back to our JSON imports, what we have to do is open the file in write mode this time, and then say json.dump cars file. And then, of course, file.close. Let's run that. Notice how it runs. Cars_JSON gets created, and it contains our dumped JSON. Notice, though, it's not nicely formatted, and that's fine. JSON doesn't need any new lines or spaces or anything like that. All of these are completely optional. Just notice how it's used double quotation marks, as that is important, even though we used single quotation marks in our dictionaries. Python does not care for our strings whether we use double or single quotation marks, but JSON does, so it uses that. If you had a string variable that you wanted to turn into a dictionary, you can do that. For example, let's say my JSON string is something like this. This is completely wrong, by the way. I know very little about cars. Let's say you've got this JSON string of this Alfa Romeo car that was released in 1950. Probably pretty wrong. I'm guessing it's more like much later. But nonetheless, let's say you have this JSON string here and you want to turn it into a dictionary. You can do that. But this time, instead of using load that turns a JSON file into a dictionary, we're going to use load s for load string. So, incorrect. Car is going to be json.loads, and notice how the first argument is a string, or rather s, which stands for string, and that's going to be my JSON string, and then you can print incorrect car name Bane. We're going Batman here. Name. There we go. Then you can print that. Oh, sorry, it's in a list, so of course you have to access element 0 first. My bad. If you notice that, well done. And there you have Alfa Romeo printed out. So load s allows you to turn a JSON string into a dictionary, and of course, dump s allows you to turn a dictionary into a string. Pretty straightforward to use. I won't give you an example of that because, if you have a dictionary like or a JSON thing like this one, like this list or a dictionary, you can use dump s to turn whatever construct you've got into JSON, a JSON string. So JSON allows you to use lists and dictionaries. It does not allow you to use tuples. So that's important. Just make sure to use lists and dictionaries. Don't use tuples. And you can use pretty much anything else like strings, numbers, floats. And the JSON module will automatically call the wrapper function, the dunder wrapper function of your objects if you choose to include any object in here. Generally, though, try to avoid objects. in a JSON, just because when you load them up, it's just going to be a string and it's going to be really difficult to understand what's going on. So if you want to turn your objects into JSON, which we will do shortly, make sure that you describe your objects using a dictionary. For example, you can make a dictionary out of the object's variable properties and their values. That way you can then export your objects as a JSON string if you want to. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. We're going to be doing just that, exporting our objects as JSON later on in the course. And indeed, in some of the courses I've gone, we use things like that as well. So it's a pretty popular approach to turn objects and to turn your variables into JSON so that you can save them into files, read them nicely, and also so you can send them over the internet, because that's a popular thing to do with JSON. All right, so that's enough of that. We've looked at CSVs and JSON. They're two very popular ways of storing data. JSON much more popular for sending data over the internet. And now that we are able to read and write data in this variety of formats, we are good to start creating apps that persist data into a disk, save data into a disk, and allows it to store it between its runtimes. In the next section, we're going to be creating a nice project. But now I wanted to move on to a couple other things like importing our own files and our own modules, just so you can start dividing your program into constituent parts as opposed to having everything in a single file. This is pretty important. Whenever you're creating a larger app, you're going to be dividing it into multiple files. So knowing how to interact between those two and how the imports work in a lower level is going to be really important.